this is the thing, if it goes wrong now, then afterwards it'll only go right. Okay, so you are in a historical building. Actually, Amsterdam was one of the first places where official trading was happening, and particularly in securities. And it was already in 1603 when that happened here in Amsterdam, organized by the VOC. And here you see a painting of the first building that was actually the location to do these things. And then the building in which you are now was constructed in or about 1900 by Berlage. And the interesting thing about this is that when he built this building in order to take care of the trading, what he said is, I don't believe that trading will go on in the future, so I'm actually going to build it in such a way that it's just a meeting place for people. And that's what it is, and that's what you are, why you are here. But of course he was totally wrong. It's still, the trading is still going on, but it's just next door. And so now from then on, basically, this building is being used for all kinds of events, among which conferences. So in case you thought you would be arriving alone here, you're not. We have about 750 people registered, and it's still growing, for the conference. And here you see a kind of an overview of where they all come from. An interesting thing is that it's really across the whole globe. I think we counted about 50 countries being present here, so I think that's quite amazing. Here you have, I'm not sure if you can read this, but these are countries and the number of people coming from the different countries. Of course, the top one is the Netherlands. People always go to the places that are nearby. And so what we did is we actually ran a random walk model to see how many hops it takes to get to this place here from any place in the world, and counted then the amount of people that did that random walk. And so you see we have actually 3 winners. If you calculate the mean square displacement, you get 3 winners: Singapore with 9 participants from over 10,000 kilometers away, University of Auckland, and University of Melbourne. So these people have traveled an amazing distance, and a lot of them actually. So here is this famous word cloud you see, and the thing of what I like about this word cloud is you really get an impression about all these different topics that we are dealing with. It goes all the way from engineering to philosophy, and from philosophy back to theoretical physics, and it's all there. And I think that's one of the signatures of complex systems research. We have about 16 rooms for breakout sessions for the satellites as well as the parallel sessions. And we have decided to go green as much as possible. As you notice, you don't have a conference bag, so that's one of the things you do not have to throw away, because you don't have it. But we have it online. And so just click on the green bag, and you will find leaflets and bits and pieces of information that you might find of interest. This is really the most important slide. A conference like this, of course, is dynamically changing as we speak. So it might be that at some point in time we have to shift around, chairs, or we have to shift around some lectures. I hope not too much anymore. You can find the details of that at schedule.ccs2016.org. The SSID of the wireless is hashtag CCS2016. You just go there, it's open. And please double check, triple check your sessions. And if there's any, okay, then of course we have the sponsors, which is very important. Again, we are in a gorgeous place, which is way too expensive. So we managed to get quite significant sponsorship from all these groups that I show over here. I really want to thank them for that. Another thanks goes to these people here, and I thought I'd do this at the beginning of the conference rather than at the end, just to that you recognize them and you are aware of what they have done. So this is Saskia, Rick, BV, and Yuki. They really basically did all the work. So I'm really happy and really thankful to them. Okay, so finally, There are people with this orange t-shirt saying CCS on one side and the other side, how can I help you? So if you have any question with respect to whatever it is, don't hesitate to go and talk to them. And we also have a Twitter thing set up, so feel free to tweet about it and let us know what you think and how we can improve and what you like and what you don't like. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the person who's going to open the conference. It's the new president of the University of Amsterdam. She's just started her job. President of the board, we call that President of Amsterdam, President of the University of Amsterdam. And so it's my pleasure to welcome Geert on board.
Well, at least it's the same jacket. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this 2016 conference on complex systems. In particular, I would like to welcome you to the University of Amsterdam, of which I'm Peter Tolso, the new president. It's really an honor and privilege to host this important event. Well, it's not a coincidence that this conference is taking place in Amsterdam, because since its humble beginnings in the 12th century, the city has presented its inhabitants with challenges of its own. At about 6 meters under sea level, the most notorious, of course, is our water problem and the ever-present risk of flooding. Successfully managing this communal threat has traditionally required a wide array of expertise and skills, and it has demanded a collective effort by individuals closely interacting with one another. And all of this is very beautifully illustrated by the historian Russell Shorto in his book Amsterdam, A History of the World's Most Liberal City. And as Shorto points out, and I quote, "The water, the peril and the development of complex communal organizations to cope with the threat explains much of Amsterdam's history." But nowadays, as we all know, Amsterdam has to tackle a lot more challenges related to 21st century urbanism than just our water problem. By doing so, we interact with other big cities around the world and of course also with other knowledge institutes. As a university that is embedded in its host city, the University of Amsterdam shares the conviction that strength lies in cooperation and boundary crossing, because, as Amsterdam shows, when individuals interact, elaborate networks arise that often leads to surprising results. And this is why Amsterdam stimulates interdisciplinary research between its researchers. Our focus on interdisciplinarity is also at the heart of the University of Amsterdam newly created Institute for Advanced Studies, which will be officially launched later this afternoon. And this new institute will bring together research from various disciplines to generate ideas, to expand knowledge, and to develop new research frameworks. And such innovative frameworks are needed now more than ever. As a society, we are faced with complex questions that defy simple, straightforward answers. Taking a complexity approach to such questions and think, for instance, about urbanization or the need for sustainable growth, or within my own field of research, the increasing inequality of educational opportunities and societal participation, while studying such questions as complex systems promises to yield new knowledge and insights. In my view, your conference, the Conference of Complex Systems, is a perfect platform to encourage such an approach and to stimulate further research into complex networks. Over the next 4 days, you will learn more about some of the fields in which complexity theory is producing novel insights. And no doubt, I think that by the end, your interaction, just like that between the early inhabitants of Amsterdam, will have laid the groundwork for successful future collaboration. Well, to conclude, I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who made this conference possible. Of course, the organizers, Peter told already, and the sponsors, but especially the General Scientific Chair, Professor Peter Sloot. And I wish you a productive and very enjoyable conference. And of course, don't forget to enjoy our beautiful city as well. Thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you very much. Next we have the president of the Society for Complex Systems, and let me see, here he is, Professor Yamir Moreno. Let's welcome him on stage.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking the organization. All of you that have organized conference this big, I'm sure you will agree with me that this is a huge effort. Peter and the organizing committee have done an amazing job. Of course, we have to come at some point to Amsterdam. Was one of the biggest or the big cities in Europe that was missing the conference of the Complex System Society. And I'm very happy that Peter took that and did an amazing job. So let's now enjoy the conference. I would like to take a few minutes just to talk about the society, because it's important also that you know a few facts about the society. This is the main purpose of the society. We all work on the field of complexity, and the society is a body that tries to promote research in complexity science, to build new bridge between different disciplines that have to do with complexity science, to promote the dissemination of our work, also to encourage young students and postdocs to share their ideas and to provide an environment in which they can interact with colleagues more senior or at the same stage career. We would like also as a society to promote interdisciplinarity. Nowadays, you know that this is compulsory if you want to solve a real problem. So as a society, we would like to be inclusive and bring with us people working in diverse areas such as social sciences, engineering, biological sciences, economy, social, and physicists, mathematics, computer science. So we are expanding continuously, and we would like to provide space for all these scientists to interact, to find common problems, and with their own expertise to try to tackle those problems. So the society promotes and supports this conference. This conference is a flagship conference of the society, and it's organized on behalf of the society. But this is not the only thing that we do as a society. We also have a thematic school support program that is aimed to provide some financial support to schools that are on the area of complexity science. So essentially what we do is to pay the registration fee of a few students that are attending the school, and all that are members of the society are eligible to ask for the funds. And also if you are organizing a school, you can also ask the society to support students participating in the school that are members of the society. Also, I would like to mention the Joint Research Network on Complex Systems. This is an essential part of the society. Essentially, it's like a sub-society in the sense that they agglutinate all young people, and they have a lot of activities, mainly in one of the school that is a few days before the conference, and it took place here during the weekend. They will have a job fair and panel discussion with senior scientists, and this will be during these days. They also offer mobility grants, so we provide some funds, and they are completely autonomous in granting these grants for mobility, for exchange of students or young postdoc. And also, the society promotes, since a couple of years ago, a few prizes, a few awards. Most importantly, the Senior and Junior Scientific Awards that recognize those that have achieved outstanding results in the field of complexity science. We will have the award ceremony this year during the social dinner. So all that are going there will know who are the awardees of this year. Finally, just a sketch of what the society is. The society is organized as a president, 2 vice presidents, Alain Barrat and Guido Caldarelli. Then we have an executive committee, that is the governing board of the society. The council, that is one-third of the council is renewed every year. And actually, this year we are renewing the council. So before September 28, all that are here are members of the society, so you can also opt to be member of the council. Candidature can be submitted up to September 28, and then we will vote. So please register and apply. And then we have the steering committee of the conference that is chaired by Stefano Saperi. It's important to remark 2 aspects. One is that in the website of the society you have a lot of information, and you as a member of the society can use the website to give information to the rest of the community. If you have a job advertisement, a conference, or whatever that is in the field of complexity science, you can do it in your profile. Also, you have to activate your membership to the society. If you are here, it's because you pay the registration fee, and the registration fee of the conference include the membership fee of the society. All what you have to do is to go to your profile and then click there to renew your voting right, and it should be already activated. If you don't, if there is anything that is asked, like keyword or whatever, it's CCS2016, and then we cross-check that all that have activated their voting members are actually members of the society. And then in open ballots, you can vote, and you can also candidate yourself to different positions of the society. So just to conclude, let me just remind that this is a conference that was started in 2004 in Turin. That was the first edition back in 2004. We are now in Amsterdam. These are all the cities that we have visited with the society. Last year we went global in the sense that we changed the name from the European Conference on Complex Systems to Conference on Complex Systems, because we, for the first time, did the conference in the United States, in Tempe, Arizona. Then we will have the next edition in 2017. The venue is already selected and will be announced at the last date. I will just advance that it is, again, will be out of Europe. We are open to candidacies for 2018. So if you are willing to organize the next edition in 2018, you are welcome to submit your candidacy. Just contact us, and we will provide some instruction about what we more or less asked for them. So finally, I would like again to thank you very much, the organizers, and in particular the chairman of the conference, Peter. And I will also like to wish all of us to have a great conference, both scientifically and in terms of interaction with our colleagues. Thank you very much.
So I hope you like the lineup of our keynotes as much as I do. We have, I think, a pretty impressive list of keynotes. And I'm very happy to start with Doyne Farmer, who will give the first keynote address. Now, somewhere in 1987, if I'm correct about this, the whole idea of looking at the economy as a complex system basically started somewhere in Santa Fe. And it was a whole new way of looking at the economy. And since then, the whole idea of economy complexity or complex economy has been moving forward. And Doyne is going to enlighten us on what has happened since then and what's going to happen, hopefully, in the near future. So let's welcome Doyne to the show.
Well, let me just begin by saying it's a pleasure to be here. I thank all of you who got up early in the morning, came here for the first day of the conference to hear me. I know it's not always easy. I'm glad Peter reminded me of this 1987 conference in Santa Fe, where I have to admit at the time I was kind of a bystander in that Phil Anderson tapped his team of physicists and Ken Arrow tapped his team of economists, and we spent 2 weeks conflicting with each other about what economics should be as a scientist. And at the time I thought, well, I'm just here for anthropological and curiosity reasons. But then I ended up later in my career, well, I should say at the time, I should actually stress that, and one of the reasons I'm excited about being here and seeing such a large crowd is that in 1988, we started what I believe was the first complex systems group at Los Alamos. And I actually led that group at the time until 1991, when I then started a company that did financial prediction, quantitative financial prediction. And that got me really interested in economics because I started reading the literature and I felt I was not seeing the right ideas about how to think about the economy there. So may I have where's my clicker? Here it is, good. Clicker is not, oh, yep. It's a little slow. It's not, oh, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to place my thinking about complexity economics in the context of what I'm going to call the emergent collective consciousness. And what do I mean by that? Well, oh, sorry, but I'm still stuck on the outline. Let's see. And by consciousness, I mean a model of oneself. And by collective consciousness, I mean the collection of models we use to understand the economy. And in particular, as we evolve as a society, we're getting a little better at understanding the cause-effect relationships of our actions and what they imply. Now, I want to sort of isolate 3 levels of awareness. One is we model our external environment. Another is that, and so as an example, early on we figured out planetary motion. Now that was quite a striking thing that actually dramatically changed our religious views of the world and many other things. But from a practical point of view, and apart from being able to put, Neil Armstrong on the moon and things like that, it allows us to at least think about the ability to avoid asteroid collisions. Now I had thought we had this under control, but then I started reading about it and I discovered, well, actually, we only can avoid an asteroid collision if we're lucky enough that somebody's looking and sees it. We can see them up to 10 years ahead, but if nobody happens to look, we won't see one, and it'll just hit us. And as most of you probably know, an asteroid collision, and we've had them in the past, that would more or less wipe out society as we know it now, or at least put a big dent in it, a bit like having a small nuclear war. But we need to put a satellite up if we're going to be able to do that. So another example where we're not quite doing things right. Weather prediction, I would argue, is a pretty major tribute to us as a society. Weather prediction is inherently hard. We now do a pretty good job of it. And since 1980, our weather forecasts have been getting better and better, though we had to try for 30 years before we got to that point. We're increasingly also able to model our effect on the environment, climate change being a rather striking example. We're now making predictions about things that are 50 to 100 years ahead of how the world will change as a result of our actions. And it's, of course, very appropriate to talk about this in Amsterdam. I can't help but think of this every time I come here, because with the news that some of you may have followed in Nature last year, they discovered that irrespective of any forecasts or anything, the western Antarctic ice sheet is moving, and it will inexorably move, and it will increase sea level by 2.5 meters. We don't know exactly when, but we do know that it's going to do that. And we have to worry that if Greenland gets below about 1,000 meters, that because Greenland is just a big sheet of ice that's there because the wind hits it, it lifts up, and then it deposits snow on it. If it gets below about 1,000 meters, it goes all the way down, and that's another 2.5 meters. And while the Dutch have been exceedingly ingenious at keeping the sea at bay, at a certain point, it might be a little strange to be sitting in Amsterdam with a big wall out there separating us from the sea and electric motors pumping the rivers up into the sea. So anyway, an appropriate place to think about these things. Now, we're also starting to model our own collective effect on ourselves. So a good example is, say, traffic forecasting. In the last few years, those of you who use Google Maps will note that it can give you pretty good estimates of how long it's going to take you to go somewhere and where all the blockages are. So we're forecasting ourselves in a pretty good way. But then there's other things like business cycles that I would argue we're not doing such a good example of. Just to stress why this is an important problem, various estimates suggest that the last crisis cost us, as the world, around tens of trillions of dollars in output. And you see in this time series here, starting in 1967, you see that big down dip there for the financial crisis. Now, it's also interesting to notice there's a pretty big one back in the 70s as well. But so if we could somehow do something about this, even shave a little bit off of these dips when they occur, that seems to be worth a lot. Now, I also want to stress that this isn't just about rich people and money, it's about the poorest people. This plot shows what happens from various financial crises in the past to unemployment, reference to unemployment at the beginning of the period, and showing how unemployment how unemployment grows during a financial crisis and gets up at the levels of 20%. And any of those who are coming here, any of those of you who are coming here from Greece or Spain are well familiar with what's still the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, whose origins are still somewhat disputed. Now, before I can tell you anything about complexity economics, I have to say a little bit about regular economics to make the distinction. And so I'm going to walk you through, in about a minute, how a normal economic model works. It's a standard template, and in economics, I have to say it's very standard. If you don't follow this template in economics, they say you do not have a theory. So you assume agents have preferences and beliefs. You assume there's a fixed point equilibrium. Actually, there's a little star by that one because sometimes it could be some other kind of equilibrium. But for all practical purposes, we'll say it's a fixed point equilibrium where agents maximize their preferences according to their beliefs. And then in the strong form, those preferences are utilities, and the beliefs are based on complete rationality. And then the program over the last 30 years in economics has been to modify the assumptions of this one at a time by small tweaks and see where that leads. Now, let me just stress before going forward that, say, for the physicists in the audience, physicists often initially think that by equilibrium, economists mean the thing they're familiar with. That's really not true. It's a very different notion of equilibrium. And so I want to distinguish physical equilibria or even dynamical equilibria, which I'm going to use in a very specific way. A dynamical equilibrium is when the dynamical system settles to a fixed point, from economic equilibria, which is about strategic equilibrium. So in an economic equilibrium, agents have fully considered each other's behavior and arrived at something like a Nash equilibrium, where if the other agent holds his strategy fixed, there's nothing they can do to improve their utility going forward. Now, the epitome of this kind of model is what's come to be called a dynamic stochastic general equilibrium, or DSGE model. And Andy Haldane, just to give you the concept, in a, I have to admit, a slightly derogatory way, has dubbed this the rocking horse economy. Because imagine a rocking horse, assume it's in equilibrium, Zeus comes along and hits it with a shock, and it starts rocking, and then it relaxes back toward equilibrium, and we're now taking the dynamics and kinetics of the rocking horse into account. That's what the model does. And then Zeus hits it with another shock. And okay, they can also diagnose something about those shocks, because actually Zeus isn't just hitting it with one shock, he's hitting it with 8 different kinds of shocks. And in the model you try and back out which kind of shocks are actually entering from the world. And this has led to what's called a real business cycle model. And before I show you a real business cycle, so a real business cycle model is of this form. The assumption is that the business cycle is caused by these shocks hitting. But let's look at a business cycle. So here we're seeing the logarithm of GDP and the deviation from the generally upward trend. And what you can see is there's fairly large fluctuations. And to, the eye of somebody like me who grew up in my academic career doing chaos and dynamical systems, I go, okay, another example of moderately high dimensional chaos. Okay. But meaning, the question is, actually on this next slide, what's going on in that cycle? Is it really being driven by some outside shocks that we can't hope to understand? And I want to stress here that as soon as you use some form of noise, like economic shocks, you've imposed an a priori fundamental limit on what you're going to be able to do with the model. You've basically admitted there's a bunch of stuff out there that I don't understand. I'm going to model that as noise, and then I'm going to look at how the noise is reshaped as it goes through the system. So it's not that this is a useless thing to do, but it's a very strongly self-limiting thing to do. In contrast, you might believe, as I do, that these oscillations are actually endogenous oscillations that are generated by non-equilibrium behavior of the system. But before I go on to talk about dealing with that, let me just make the point that this is what I'm going to call the fundamental problem of macroeconomics, that if you look back through history, well, notice the time scale on this plot. We're going back here to about 1955. This is the US. We can track and measure these business cycles pretty well back to, say, 1900. But the further back we go, the less well we measure all the other data that might be relevant for what's actually causing this. And furthermore, the more different the economy is getting from the economy we have now. So there's a fairly small number of these cycles, maybe 15 trips around the attractor that we have historically recorded to base our models on. So if we're going to make a model that's going to have a lot of parameters, because the world, after all, is a fairly complicated place, how are we ever going to estimate those parameters on such a limited data set? So I think that's a very fundamental problem. Now, let me just say, and this might be a little bit an odd thing to say to some people, I argue that agent-based modeling can actually potentially solve this by using microdata, and I'll come back to explain that a bit later. Now, why are non-equilibrium approaches needed from a fundamental point of view? Well, equilibrium in economics assumes that beliefs and outcomes are consistent with each other, that people understand the world well enough to line those things up, and they act on their beliefs to make things consistent. But if that's not happening, then I think you can intuitively see why fixed point dynamics becomes much less guaranteed. It's not even guaranteed, by the way, when they're consistent, which is the asterisk I was putting before. Yet it's almost always assumed. Now, to illustrate the limits to economic equilibrium, I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about what's called the Keynes beauty contest. So Keynes brought this up to illustrate the fact that in markets, it's not what's actually true that affects prices, it's what people believe to be true. And by the way, I should make just a little segue. If you want to, for very interesting writing on markets that's very appropriate for this venue, you should see Daniel Defoe, who wrote Robinson Crusoe and visited the Dutch stock exchange around the time that in the early 1600s, and just wrote this beautiful essay on what a crazy place it was. Of course, at the time, the Dutch were busy inventing financial derivatives, which led to the tulip bubble and so forth. But back to Keynes. So in Keynes's time, there were these beauty contests where pictures of women would be published in the paper, and you were asked to vote on the woman you thought most beautiful, and then those who voted for the woman who was eventually chosen to be the most beautiful could win a prize of some sort in a raffle. Now, of course, Keynes pointed out that of course, it doesn't matter for winning the prize who's actually the most beautiful. There's probably no objective criterion for that anyway. It's who everybody else thinks is the most beautiful. And he said that's really what stock markets are about. Now, to test your ability to play in such a beauty contest, here's a little numerical version. Name a number between 0 and 100. And you're going to be the winner of this contest if your guess is 2/3 of the average guess of everybody in the room. Now, I won't play this with you because I've discovered that even in sophisticated groups, the answers can be embarrassing. But you might think about your guess. I'll give you 10 seconds to make a guess. I want everybody to make one. It's a good exercise to try and think about how you would go about guessing. Okay, I'll give you a little time to make your guess. All right, now, what did a bunch of people in Denmark guess when a Danish newspaper held this contest? They had, I think, my Danish isn't very good, 32,000 submitters. So now you get to see the guess. And if you thought about this a little bit, you might have realized, well, if everybody guesses at random, let's even suppose everybody guessed 1. What would be the correct answer if everybody but me guessed 1, and I'm just one of a very few people? Well, it'd be 2/3. So therefore, you see, you can eliminate everything to the right side of 2/3. That's 66. So there's a bunch of people in there that either didn't understand the contest or were complete idiots. Actually, they're not complete idiots, because I recently did this with a crowd, and a bunch of people who had training in PhDs in economics and computer science actually guessed in that domain. Now, what if everybody guessed at random? Then the average answer would be 50. In which case, now let's call this a level 1 reasoner. The level 1 reasoner would say, okay, 1/3. You can see there's a hefty spike there at 1/3. So there's a bunch of people who went through that process. They had more time than you did and thought about it and said, okay, I'm going to reason at level 1, assume everybody else guesses at random, I'll guess 1/3. But then there's the 2-level reasoners who say, well, so if people are going to guess, will think that through and they'll guess 1/3, I'm going to guess 2/3 of 1/3, which is around 22, and you see another spike there, and that's the winner. Now, if you were trained in economics in a traditional model that I said, you might be inclined to say, well, let's assume people are rational. Now, if you assume people are rational, then they can iterate this process indefinitely, and you can see where the answer is going to end. It's going to end at 0. And in fact, there is a little spike there at 0 of those people. So, okay, I'm going to make a snide remark with apologies to anybody this offends. If the people who guessed greater than 66 were idiots, those are the idiot savants. So, why am I saying that? Well, they had a correct reasoning process, but they had a poor behavioral model. Now that might change because, for example, the Financial Times has been running this repeatedly, and actually, when you run it repeatedly, the mass does creep towards that end of the axis. So it depends on your reference point. Now, when is this equilibrium justified? I'm now going to show you a way to think about that. We did a test of this in the context of game theory with Tobias Gala. We assume there are some players who can choose one of several possible actions. These players receive payments based on the combined actions of all the other players. So in other words, there's some kind of a lookup table where if they make action B and the other player makes action C, you can look up at the table and see what payoff each of the 2 players will get. We're going to play that game repeatedly, and we're going to make the players learn their strategies. And I just want to note there's a significant pre-existing literature on this I'm not going to cite here. It's in the paper. And so in order to get at what typical behavior was, and the question of when do you expect you will converge to a fixed point equilibrium, and when do you expect something else will happen, and if so, what is that something else? We just made up a lot of games at random. So that is, we populated this payoff matrix at random, and then we played the game with our players with a certain learning strategy that I'll say something about, and then we did that again and again. So the analogy, if you're familiar with fluid dynamics, might be to physics, where we know the Reynolds number provides you with a good idea about how turbulent, how predictable a fluid flow will be. Now, when we did this, let me just give you an intuition, which is that simple games should be easier to learn than hard games. When I was a kid, to illustrate Nash equilibrium, when I was about 9, we were playing tic-tac-toe, or noughts and crosses, as they call it in Britain. So you make a little grid, you put an X or a 0, and there was a few days where I figured out that I could play, even if I went second, I could play in such a way that I always got a draw. And I felt really cool. Till all my friends figured it out, and tic-tac-toe got really boring. Now, basically what had happened is we as 9-year-olds had discovered the Nash equilibrium for tic-tac-toe. Now you can ask, well, what about a game like chess? Well, so here I have to tell a joke. How do 2 economists play chess? Well, they randomly choose white or black, and then they argue about whether white or black wins under the Nash equilibrium of the game. Now, in case you didn't get it, The point is that we don't know what the Nash equilibrium of chess is. It's a complicated game. Even the smartest minds in the world haven't figured it out. So it's a useless discussion. Now, because I'm a physicist, I should tell the corollary of the joke, which is how do two physicists play chess? Well, they get very drunk. They start moving the pieces around the board at random, and they argue about whether the game is more or less interesting under scalings of the size of the board and the number of pieces. And you'll kind of see that philosophy reflected in what we did here. All right, what did we do? We first of all picked the payoffs of the game at random. We actually did this so we could control the correlation between the payoffs of the players. So for example, we could make it so that if I'm player A, my playoffs are negatively correlated with correlation -1 to those of player B, meaning if I win, she loses and vice versa. Or we can make it so they're uncorrelated, or we can make it so they're positively correlated. We then picked a learning algorithm, which we picked based on something that's popular in the behavioral economics literature, that's been validated in experiments with human subjects, and is believed by at least the economists who did this, Cameron Ho from Caltech, to be a good model for how people actually behave when they play a game. And the way this model works is that the players learn by reinforcing the moves that worked well in the past. And they can do that actually even being hypothetical. So in the simple version of this, imagine that we play a bunch of rounds of the game, get some statistics on how well each of the different moves worked, and then we update our learning strategy and we play a bunch of rounds of the game again. So I'm not going to go through the details of this. Now, what did we see? Well, sometimes we do see convergence to stable fixed points, just like the economists would want. But other times, significant fraction of the time, we see other stuff. Like we see limit cycles. You see a picture of one up there in the top. Low dimensional chaotic attractors. Higher D is the dimension. Higher dimensional and even higher dimensional chaotic attractors. And you'll notice by the time you get to the high dimensional chaotic attractor, you have what looks like a random ball of yarn. And you see the time series underneath, and then the parameters where we found these things below. And we mapped out the state space by some fairly exhaustive numerical simulation. And we see that as a function of how much memory the players have when they're keeping track of things. In other words, do they weight, this parameter alpha allows them to give a higher weighting to the last moves they saw than the moves that happened a very long time ago, which if you think back to my business cycle slide, might be an appropriate thing to do. And so that's the parameter going horizontal here. The parameter going vertical is this correlation between payoffs parameter, which controls whether you're, if gamma is -1, zero sum game, gamma equals 0, the payoffs are uncorrelated between the players, gamma positive, they're positively correlated. So we saw a very distinct behavior with unique fixed points over on the right, the good situation for economic theory, chaos in that blue zone that could be very high dimensional, as you saw, and then for the games that were cooperative rather than competitive, gamma being positive, we saw multiple fixed points. Now, in these simulations, we had the order of 50 possible actions the players could take. I forgot to tell you, we're in the limit. We being physicists like to go to the thermodynamic limit. And so we went to a limit where we had many possible actions for the players, so the payoff matrix is really big and complicated. But as a result, we could get very crisp results. And in fact, that blue line there can be analytically calculated very accurately using replica techniques from statistical mechanics. I mean, the calculation takes 10 pages, but you can do it. So what is this? What's the punchline of all this? Well, actually, let me say one more thing on the punchline. In a subsequent paper with Saunders, James Saunders and Tobias Scala and I, we're able to calculate what happens when you have P players instead of just 2 players, as I showed you before. And what happens with P players is actually that this blue line just translates over to the right, and chaos and the multiple fixed point zone take more and more of the real estate. And so, in fact, if you look at the area of that as a function of the number of players, we can even prove that the area is going to infinity as the square root of the number of players. So in the limit where we have lots of players, we always see chaos. By the way, we also see what's called clustered volatility. That is, in stock markets, you often see that there's periods where markets get very noisy, everything gets very active, other periods where they get very quiet. It was originally believed that this was due to external influences, the noise flowing into the market. In fact, it's increasingly clear from empirical work that it's the market generating its own endogenous dynamics, which happens automatically in this model. It's kind of actually it surprised us. It was an emergent property of the model. Now I want to make a few caveats. If you were a skeptic, you'd say, well, but the algorithm you used is too crude. Kammer and Ho were wrong. That's not a good behavioral model. People are smarter than that. They'll figure this out. Over long time scales, I think there's a point to that. We have actually worked on versions of this where the players instead do this up to level K, like we saw in the experimental, or the data I showed you, say level K equals 2. We still see similar things. You can worry that somehow the way we're making up games isn't representative of the way games get made up in the real world. Fair enough. But we think it's at least a good start. And we've also recently been looking at games with a few actions, and Marco Pangallo will be talking about that on Thursday afternoon at 1:15, if I got the time right. Now, okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that there's a large region of the parameter space of what you expect in a strategic conflict where you have to worry about chaos or very complicated behavior in the state space. Now, how are we going to deal with that? If we're going to impose out of equilibrium models, we actually have to put in more structure, because one of the reasons economists like equilibrium so much is it actually simplifies things. It means they have less to do and less things to specify. It's a way of coping with what Christopher Sims called the wilderness of bounded rationality. Namely, people are complicated. Rationality is pretty unique, but people think in different ways. They're heterogeneous. There's complexities. You never quite know what they're going to do. But to do this right, you have to characterize all that. So you've got to somehow put some structure to deal with that. And I'll say in a bit something about agent-based models. But I first want to give an example of a very simple out-of-equilibrium model, just to show how this can make a difference. And I apologize, I'm looking at the time. I want to leave about 5 minutes for question, so I'm going to fly through this a bit. This relates to the problem of systemic risk, which is a natural problem for complexity economics, as you can see from the way I've defined it. So I define it as coming in financial markets when the activities of individual agents, such as their risk-avoiding behavior, cause unintended consequences due to their collective actions. So we see examples over and over where if people just optimize their behavior, only looking at themselves and assuming everybody else isn't doing the same thing, you see one kind of action is the right thing to do, but in fact, there are systemic effects that change the system dramatically when everybody takes those actions, so that what emerges is very different than what you might expect. And let me just mention in passing that there's various channels of contagion in financial markets, ranging from network properties. I assume there's a lot of people here interested in networks. Overlapping portfolios. If I have the same assets you have, you sell your assets, you depress my balance sheet, which causes me stress, which might cause me to sell my assets. Or lending networks, because you've lent something to me and I default, and now you don't have the money to pay your bills. Now, I'm going to give an example of what happens when people borrow money, which is a very common thing to do. This is called leverage in some circles, and the leverage can be defined as the ratio of the risky assets, the value of the risky assets to the equity, that's how much money you actually have. And so, for example, if you buy a house with a 20% down payment, if we call that your equity, then you have a 5-to-1 leverage. And, credit makes the world go round, as we saw in the crisis, where I would argue we had too much credit and then we didn't have enough credit. So the swing from one to the other was very painful. In fact, it's the swing when we don't have enough credit where we feel the pain. Now, all the way back in the 70s, Minsky, Hyman Minsky postulated that there was something that has come to be called a leverage cycle. So that during calm times, leverage sort of creeps up. Then because everybody's competing for returns, and then as the leverage gets higher and higher, the system gets more and more unstable, and then there's a crash. Giannakopoulos expanded on this idea, notice, before the crisis, actually in an equilibrium model that has heterogeneous investors where optimists use more leverage, and in bad times he shows how the bad news gets amplified by this. Now, here's the crisis. So a cartoon of what happened in the crisis. You can see the stock market in the dashed blue line creeping up, reaching a peak in about 2007, then coming back down. You see volatility in a sort of rust red curve, gradually going down almost through the whole period, and then starting to creep up. Leverage, you see, going up through most of the period, skyrocketing in 2007, and then crashing. So the model I'm about to show you is a model for the interaction of these variables. And to ask the question of, what's a minimal case for getting this kind of behavior? Can we, with very plausible and simple assumptions, back this kind of thing out? And the answer obviously is yes, or I wouldn't be telling you. So our model, which started with this first paper by Christoph Eimans and I and got refined in a subsequent paper, we have two agents, a bank and a fundamentalist. We have one risky asset plus cash. We make 4 assumptions. The first is that the bank uses an exponential moving average of historical volatility to estimate current volatility and therefore risk. This, I would argue, is a behavioral fact. That's what most financial investors do. They might use different timescales, they might use slightly different flavors, but they all do about that same thing. That's what we did when I was at Prediction Company, except we used 4 years. The second was they used Basel II risk management embodied in something called value at risk to set their leverage target. Now, what does that mean? They have a notion of how much leverage they want to take. Things happen if prices go up, and let me actually go to the next slide. Let me give you this key fact. If prices go up, their leverage goes up. They want to keep at their leverage target, so they sell some assets. If prices go down, sorry, wait a minute, I said that backward. When prices go down, their leverage goes up and they sell some assets. When prices go up, their leverage goes down and they borrow more money and buy more assets. The key point is that they're always, this is why they do this, and when we go back to, okay, come on, their behavior, when they do that, they are fundamentally destabilizing the market, as I'll discuss in a minute. Okay, so they use the Basel II rule, which I'll explain in a minute, to do that. For price formation, we do something completely standard. We just assume supply equals demand. But I'll note that increasing leverage target means people are buying, which increases demand, which drives prices up. And the fundamentalist buys an undervalued asset and vice versa. So the fundamentalists are around there to stabilize the world, because if all you had was the investment bank, because the investment bank's following a leverage target, the investment bank's buying when prices are rising and selling when prices are falling, so it's actually just destabilizing the market, which is an important fact that regulators need to bear in mind. So this is how the model works. We have a fund, we have a bank. The fund just detects the mispricing, updates the portfolio weights. The bank has a risk estimate, it updates the risk estimate and enforces its leverage constraint, and together they set prices. So, all right, I went through that. I already mentioned that this is destabilizing, and we need the fundamentalists there to make the model sensible. This is the Basel II risk management. The dashed green line is showing what would be the case if people just held their risk estimates constant, held their leverage targets constant. As a function of their volatility estimate, Basel II is that blue line, which means that as volatility gets bigger, they hold less assets and take less risk. So they lower their leverage target as volatility gets higher. Now, from a microprudential point of view, that's a totally sensible thing to do. But from a macroprudential point of view, as I'll show you in a moment, it has some can have rather disastrous consequences. So if you take the simple model we make, again, you can look up the paper, you see that when the banking sector is small compared to the fundamentalists, we see this is a noisy case. The price is kind of random walking around. But if we have a large banking sector, then we start to see this big oscillation happening. And furthermore, this persists even in the limit where there's no noise. So we now have an endogenous oscillation going on. Those 4 very simple assumptions led us to something that says prices are going to oscillate, and the numbers there are not arbitrary on the x-axis. Those are actually measured in years. So in fact, this cycle, which we can calibrate, has a time scale of around 10 to 15 years, depending on exactly how you set the parameters. But with numbers that I mentioned, like 2 years exponential average, you get the order of 10 to 15 years for the length of this cycle. And so, and by the way, it's actually not a strict cycle, it's a chaotic attractor. You can see the chaotic attractor there on the left, and you can see a cross-section of it on the right, showing you the sort of fractal folding structure you expect from chaotic attractors. Now, let me just say there's 2 key parameters in this model. One is alpha, which is the amount of risk the investors are willing to take, how much they're going to leverage. And the other is this parameter B, which determines what the regulators are doing and whether they're using the Basel rule or something closer to constant. As you move towards B equals 0, you get closer to constant. But so here you get a parameter diagram for what happens, and what you see is there's a leverage threshold. As long as people don't take too much risk, or as long as the banking sector is small enough, you're in a stable zone where you're sitting at a fixed point. But as you increase risk, you hit a threshold where suddenly you have a leverage cycle of finite amplitude like the ones I was showing you. And it's only a small change required to cross that threshold to get a very large finite amplitude leverage cycle. What happens there, by the way, is the hyperbolic fixed point, there's a fixed point that destabilizes. So the equilibrium, you go from the equilibrium, which is a fixed point, to tie back to my earlier talk, a stable fixed point. That stable fixed point destabilizes, becomes hyperbolic, and you get the leverage cycle. And now, does that explain this? Well, the timescales work out about right. The qualitative relationships of the variables is right. And I don't want to argue that this was the cause of the Great Moderation plus the crisis, but let me say it's sufficient to have been the cause, and the housing bubble might just have been the spark. Now, what would have happened if I'd used an equilibrium model instead? Well, this is a conjecture because nobody has really done this properly, but my conjecture is that the more rationality you build into the players, the closer, the harder it becomes to see that cycle. Because the players take each other into account, and with their foresight, they can see that this cycle would cause them problems. But realize practically how much foresight this would take. Somehow back in 2002, everybody would have had to realize, gosh, we're on this ride, and furthermore decided, well, I want to get out now rather than trying to ride the bubble up and bail out just before it happens. So there's a strategic cognitive dissonance there. And I would argue that investors didn't have that foresight. After all, we only made the model in 2015. Now, I just want to end this by saying I'm not saying equilibrium's always the wrong thing to do. I'm just saying sometimes it's not the right thing to do. I believe that's often. And I think realism drives us to non-equilibrium models that have more complicated dynamics. Now, I'm behind on my time schedule here, so I just want to make some general remarks, and I'll wave at a few results. When you think about how economics needs to be different, well, in simple words, they need to use computers in a serious way. In disciplines like physics, as soon as computers became available, people started using them. Now, it was much easier in physics because we knew the low-level laws that we wanted to simulate, and what we needed to do was to do the nonlinear mathematics to be able to see what happens when you put them together. It's a lot harder in social science because we don't have those low-level laws worked out. But I think in addition, this has to do with a cultural attitude about science that I think the time has been reached where it needs to change. Simulation in social science naturally leads you to what's called agent-based modeling. The label reflects the notion that the hard part of this is modeling what the agents do. It's putting in the social science bit of the simulation, which is different from physics because you're faced with a tough problem of how the decisions everybody's going to make. In a certain sense, you could reduce economics to a bunch of accounting and the decisions people make when they try and do stuff in the world. And getting that right is hard. Now, I want to come back to the point I alluded to earlier. One of the reasons I think this is so important to bring in is because agent-based modeling addresses potentially addresses this fundamental problem in macroeconomics because you can make use of microdata, like what people do at a microscopic level, to calibrate the individual agents in your model and their heterogeneous behavior, and then use the simulation to see what their emergent properties are at the macro level. So you could calibrate the model at the bottom as they do in climate models. If in climate models you had to actually just use global mean temperature as the only variable you could look at, it would be a hopeless task. Climate models work when you look at them closely because they actually can simulate the weather through the whole globe and they see they can get it right. And then they can do things like connect South America to Antarctica and see that in their simulation the world gets dramatically warmer as they know it did when that was the case back in the past. So you can calibrate the model by doing lots of microscopic tests on it, even though they face exactly the same kind of, in fact, even worse data limitations from historical data than macroeconomics does. But there are big challenges here. How do you estimate these models from some mixture of micro and macro data? How do you initialize them? It's a non-trivial problem in this case because, well, I don't have time to say why. I think we need standard modeling software. DSGE has succeeded in part because there's a standard software package called Doyne. Any graduate student that wants to do DSGE modeling can spend a couple of weeks learning to use Doyne, and then they can make DSGE models till the cows come home. We need that same thing for agent-based modeling, which requires cooperation among agent-based modelers, which is not easy to attain. My vision of economics in the future, somewhere in the future, I don't know whether this is 10 years from now or 50 years from now, but I think it will come about, is a real-time tandem simulation of the economies of the major countries of the world, some micro big data inputs that are taken directly off of the internet that are used to check on the model and track whether it's in the correct state. It'll be coupled to other social models, so you could think about things like politics and political crisis. It'd be used by the central banks of the world, and in that central bank there'd be a team like for households, and they'd be thinking about the model, they'd be gathering data, and they'd be checking whether their model of households was tracking what's supposed to be true. Similarly for firms and banks. You could forecast unemployment, economic prosperity. The main use I want to stress, even though you would use it for forecasting, would be policy. I think forecasting is mainly a discipline, because forecasting in these kind of things is hard for fundamental reasons. You could use this to think about things like climate change. There are limits to how well you can do this. I want to get to the end, so I'm going to, and we're trying to build an economic simulation library to do this, trying to identify the right building blocks, trying to create standards, and trying to liaison as much as we can with other agent-based modeling groups. This is to be released in a month or two. We're going to have an open source website, a kind of wiki economics, where anybody can help us create a new economics. Now there's a lot of challenges here. Okay, I've listed various other ways. I apologize that I said this was going to be about what can complexity economics do. I focused on just a few things in my talk and mainly illustrated it with my own work. But these are other things, as well as the things I've mentioned, that complexity economics can do. These are some past examples. And I'm sorry, I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to move through this very fast. I want to conclude by just asking, well, is the business cycle useful? Well, meaning some would argue that we actually need the business cycle. And let me just say, what I've been talking about is implicitly getting rid of it to avoid the damage that it causes when it's on the downturn. But some, like Schumpeterian viewpoint, would be that you need these gales of creative destruction. To answer this question, we actually need a theory that can both explain the business cycle and understand its connection to long-term growth, something we're far from having. In part because we don't have good ways to think about technological improvement, which Solow showed almost 40 years ago as the main driver of economic growth. And yet, very little has been done. You know, the economy is a process that transforms raw materials and human labor into goods and services. It's important, I think, to think about that definition rather than the narrow one that says it's about allocation of scarce resources that's driven most of the neoclassical economics that formed that standard template model. We really need to understand this whole process, and just to illustrate how complex it's gotten, this won't surprise people, this is the supply chain of a laptop computer. Your laptop computer is made in a distributed process throughout the whole world. Imagine if we had to assemble babies that way. I mean, it's complicated. And you have to really understand all these processes around the world to fully understand what's going on. And that's just, each one of the technologies in the supply chain has its own chain, its own supply chain. So it's a very complicated process. So now I'm just going to flip through some slides showing, we're actually using inspiration from biology to map out the trophic relationships of industries, and we argue that those are closely related to growth. You see China compared to the US. I don't have time to talk about it in any detail. We can actually make predictions about which countries should grow faster than others based on the trophic depth of their economy. And we're trying to understand technological patterns like Moore's law and Wright's law, and using that ability, these patterns, to forecast. So here's an example from a paper with Francois Lafond showing how we can actually make distributional forecasts whose accuracy is well calibrated by experience on past forecasting. And I want to conclude by just saying that the big problem we have to solve is sustainability. We have to understand how we can have an economy that can coexist with the rest of the planet. And can we do this in a way that the economy keeps growing? I think we can actually, but we have to dematerialize GDP in order to do that. And so we have to work on both of those processes in front, and hopefully we can do it without having to have a huge crisis. So, you know, the economy, society's metabolism, everything else in the society depends on it. I think we've seen dramatic illustrations of that. If you're from Greece, I don't have to convince you of this. And now, in order, though, to create this new economics, we have to expand the horizons of economics. We have to bring in new techniques, new epistemology, new ways of thinking about what models are and how we approach building those models. And we have to remember that at the end of the day, the economy is a complex system, and complex system engineering is like gardening. You know, you can put the seeds in the ground and you can water the plants, but you never know quite what's going to happen. And I think that there's a strong element of that here. And I want to conclude with this nice picture of Peter Bruegel the Elder called The Fish Market, presumably inspired by a scene very close to where we're standing. I always love his paintings because you can see the richness of economic life in this painting that, you know, Holland has been a great example for in its history. So thanks very much.
So I think we have time for one or two questions here. Someone can deal with the microphone. We had some help here. I'm not sure.
Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I was wondering, the value that you argue for many of the agent-based models and social models are more explanatory than predictive, but many people focus only on the predictive aspect of models. How would you answer criticisms to claim that, oh, that model is not predictive enough? And I mean, we know that they aren't predictive, but that's beyond the point.
Yeah, so you have to do, so it's a very good question. I think the hardest part in the vision that I gave is providing a model that's convincingly a good model, that actually represents what the world is doing, and is good enough that we can put we can do counterfactual experiments where we ask, what if we change this? Like, what if we change the rules? Then what outcomes do we get? So I didn't have time. I mean, I could spend actually the whole lecture talking about approaches to doing that. Let me first of all say it's not as well developed as it should be. In fact, it's not well developed at all in agent-based modeling. I'm not happy with the way it's done in DSGE either, where I'm convinced the models they use are dramatically overfit. But so basically, though, one reason I argue you need to do forecasting is because it provides you with a discipline. If your forecasts are really nonsense, then you know you're not doing a good job. You'd at the very least like to be able to beat a random walk by a little bit. Now, existing models actually beat the random walk by a little bit. That's because there's a little bit of residual correlation in the series that econometric models pick up. DSG models more or less match that. But if you could show that you could do even just a little bit better at forecasting, then and do that over and over again in an out-of-sample way, then people would really start to believe in the model, and then you start to get some confidences using your counterfactual experiments. Now, there's of course a lot of other things you can do. You do a lot of counterfactual experiments with your model to go back to things that were done in the past to see whether they generate this kind of behavior that was observed in the past. So for example, you'd like to be able to show that you can recreate the business cycle over the last 80 years, say, and see that you're kind of matching what's happening, and you can maybe forecast it a little better than the other models a year ahead, which if you can capture the endogenous dynamics rather than doing it from external shocks, I think could be done. But I don't think it's an easy job. I'm reminded of weather forecasting where physical weather forecasting started in 1950. It didn't break even with subjective weather forecasting until 1980, and only now is it dramatically better.
Yes, can I make the question? Yes. Would you then imagine an economy that is based, instead of economic value as the main driver, as technical value as the main driver, as effectiveness, technological effectiveness of the movements that are done within economics, the decisions based on technological value rather than economical value, not comparing ends and means by the value of both variables, but the technological effectiveness. Would you foresee something like that?
So I'm not sure I understand the question fully, but I'm going to answer it in an indirect way, and you can tell me whether I've got it. I mean, first of all, there's a lot of drivers in the economy. And there are short-term drivers and there are long-term drivers, and you have to take all those into account if you're going to do a good job. So this Keynesian supply dynamics, supply-demand dynamics, is a kind of driver, I think, of the oscillations on a 5 to 10-year time scale. Over the longer term, technological change becomes the important driver. And the two things are interacting. It's not clear how strongly they're interacting, but they're interacting. So you need both of those ultimately in your model to answer the questions that I posed here. Now regarding values, I mean, at the end of the day, you have to ask what world, let's suppose we had the model that had, was a realistic representation of the economy. Now what do we get it to do? Well, that's up to us to decide what are our goals, which world do we want to live in. The purpose of the model is to tell us the cause and effect relationships. If we choose this kind of economic regulatory structure, this is the kind of world we'll get out of it at the other end. That's the main purpose of the model, in my view.
Okay, Doyne, thank you very much. It was an absolutely great talk. So let's thank him again.
Thank you.
Don't walk away. Doyne,
Yep.
I have a small present, so we need to take a picture.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so we're now on to our coffee, tea, and whatever break we have. And check the schedule for all the sessions that are going to go on. And I'll see you after the break.